As part of continuing the educational program of the Communist Party, it has come to a head that the party will be beginning the Cultural Revolutionism Program's advancement to a next phase, that being readings from Communism's Creek. Communism's Creek is a portion of territory that has been seized by the party for the sake of expanding its work in the current region. So, we'll begin with readings of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. A specter is haunting America, the specter of communism. All the powers of the old forms have entered into an alliance to rid themselves of the specter. Pope and Tsar, Menelik and Guizot, radicals and police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its parties in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all powers to be itself a power. Two, it is our time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet the tale of a specter of communism with the manifesto of the party itself. To this end, all communists will assemble. Bourgeois and proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Free man and slave, partisan and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on and uninterrupted, now hidden, now open, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In almost all of these classes throughout history, subordination of rank. The bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression in the forms of struggle in place of old ones. That is just now in the epoch that we are enduring, as capitalism in its morbidness must utilize fascism as the only means of keeping capital in motion, as the only means of keeping the wage slaves within the confines of the society. Fascism has developed into the final phase of capitalism's decay and the only means of maintaining the militarization of the world. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps. For ourselves, that is the capitalistic camp and the communistic camp. Two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeois and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the world, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese economies The colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new economies. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed aside by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each workshop. Meantime, the economy kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of the manufacturer was taken by the giant industry, the place of the industrial middle class by the industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies, capitalists, and the bourgeoisie. Industry has established the world economy, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, communication by land. This development has, in its turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extend, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increasing its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, it became an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany. There, taxable estate of the monarchy, as in France. Afterwards, in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or absolute monarchy as counterposed against the nobility, and in fact cornerstone of the great monarchies. In general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of industry of the world, conquered for itself in the representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie has played a role in history. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, judicial, idealistic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound humanity to their natural superiors, and has left no bond between humanity and humanity than naked self-interest, then callous caste payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that one lone, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religion and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, the people of science, into its paid wage slaves. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indulgence. It has been the first to show that humanity's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former migrations of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane, and humanity is at last compelled to face with somber senses the real conditions of their lives and the relations with their kind. The need of a constantly expanding economy for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world economy, given a cosmopolitan character to the production and consumption in every country. We'll go with given a capitalist character. To the great chagrin of reactionaries, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the notions of the ground on which it stood, because it is a notion, that's why it gets taken away from you. All the old established notions of industry have been destroyed. That's why it gets destroyed, because it's a notion. Or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized notions, because it's only a notion. As civilized as you want it to be. By the industries that no longer work up in indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every corner of the globe. In the place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In the place of the old local notions of seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, absolute interdependence of everything. As in the material, so also in the intellectual production. The intellectual creations of the individuals become common property. The notions of one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous notions that accumulate, the local literature there arises a world literature. Now, we'll take a moment here at that word literature. For ourselves and our conditions, the educational system of the public is a complete and utter failure. That is because it bases itself on the maxiom of one nation under a God. There is no God, and there is no one nation. All there is the inevitability of communist humanity. Because of that, it's the Communist Party's responsibility to educate the masses of humanity, to expound based off of the scientific communistic literature that we can seize that has been brought to us by the immense struggles of scientific socialism and communism's inevitability. Because that maxim is unbefitting to humanity, and therefore it is our responsibility as class-conscious peoples to destroy it. Replace the old form with something new, something befitting to the species, something better. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immense speculative means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, into civilization. The cheap pieces of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intense, obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all, on the pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, to become bourgeois themselves, become capitalists. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of such a life. Just as it has made the country depend on the towns, so it has made the barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations, all but notions, of the peasants on economies of the bourgeoisie, the economy of the East on the economy of the West. More and more, the bourgeoisie keeps doing away with scattered states of population, of the means of production, and of property. It has amalgamated population, centralized means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization, hence the Communist Party. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation become lumped together into one monopoly, one government, one code of laws, one class interest, one frontier, one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to humanity, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, channelization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a precedent that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see then that the means of production and of exchange, which served as the foundation for the growth of the bourgeoisie, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these productions, means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society proceeded at exchange, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in a word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into the place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar moment is going on before our own eyes. Bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, which they have called up by their spells. Because landowners, these capitalists, this bourgeoisie, all their reactionaries, try as they might, cannot have control over, domination of, or enslaving the masses of the working class any longer. The Communist Party is a reflection of this inevitable development. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of productive forces against the conditions of production. against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return, but the existence of the entire bourgeois society is at an end, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And no sooner do they overcome these fetters than they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of the bourgeoisie society are too narrow to compromise the wealth created by them. That is exactly what has gone about in the conditions of struggle in which we are going through. That is why the ruling class must utilize a fascistic dictatorship in order to keep the means of production, the working class globally, subordinated to itself in this or that way, through militarization and only by the utilization of bomb and rifle. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? By enforced destruction of a massive productive forces, by the conquest of new economies, and by the more thorough exploitation of old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for the more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons which the bourgeois felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the humanity that is to wield those weapons. The working class, the proletarians, in proportion as the bourgeoisie capital is developed in the same proportion as the proletariat. The working class developed the class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and to all the fluctuations of the economy, owing to the extensive use of machinery and to divisions of labor. The work of the proletarians has lost all its individual character, and consequently all charm of work people. They become an appendage of the machinery. It is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of them. Hence, the cost of production of the working people is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that they require for their maintenance and for the propagation of the race of workers. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. No more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolonging of the working hours, by increase of the work extracted at a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized as soldiers, privates of the industry army, and placed under the command of a hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the lone bourgeois manufacturer themselves. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, the more industry develops, the more is labor of humanity superseded by changes of gender. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinction of social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner has the laborer received his wages in cash, for the moment escaping exploitation by the manufacturer, that he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlords, the shopkeepers, the pawnbroker, so on and so forth. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers and retired tradesmen, generally the handicrafts people and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because the diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which industry is carried on, and it is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. The proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contents is carried on by people who are individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the lone bourgeois, who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash machinery to pieces. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the working people of Middle Ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and unbroken by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is more still able to do so for a time. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies. The remnants of the absolute monarchy, the landowners, which we should, the non-industrial bourgeois, which we should, the petty bourgeois, which we should. The whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized in the proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduce wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the worker ever more fluctuating. The unceasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The conclusion between the workmen and the individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations against the bourgeoisie. They get together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding mass of workers. This mass is furthered by the improved means of communication, which are created by industry, and which place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one struggle between these classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the proletarians, thanks to the march, achieved in a few years. The organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger and firmer, mightier. It dictates legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the division among the bourgeois itself. Altogether, collision between the classes of the old society furthered the course of development of the proletariat in many ways. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry. At all times, the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all of these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. It furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Entire sections of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of society, culminates in such a violent, glaring character that a section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to a level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole, of all classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie. Today the proletariat alone is a real revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative. More, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They defend their present, but their future interests. They defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to adopt that of the proletariat. The dangerous clash, the social scum, lumpen proletariat, that passively rotting mass by the lower layers of society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare far more for the part of a rival tool of reactionary intrigue. The social conditions of society no longer exist for the proletariat. The proletariat is without property. Its relations to their wives and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Industrial labor, subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped themselves of their every trace of character. Law, morality, religion are to them so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become possessors of productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of private property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lower stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a local struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, which is what we're developing towards through socialist war, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonisms of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to the membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of the feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class, of their own class. They become paupers, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within their slavery. because it cannot help letting them sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by them. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. Its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential character for the existence and sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The conditions for capital is wage labor. Wage slavery rests exclusively on competition between the wage laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their evolutionary combination due to society. The development of industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces appropriates products. What the bourgeois therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. We will continue with part 2 at a later time.